G'day, I'm Catherine DeVrye from Sydney, Australia, on the other side of the ocean to most of you. And the ocean is an amazing analogy for change. As American President Woodrow Wilson once said, the man who swims against the tide knows the strength of it. Today, he would also say, and the woman. And as caregivers, what a tide you swim against on a daily basis. I grew up in Calgary, Canada. I never saw the ocean, and I went to the University of Montana. Now I'm a volunteer surf lifesaver at Manly Beach in Australia. But even before I'd seen the ocean, I learned a long time ago that we can't always control change any more than we can turn back the tide. But we can always control our attitude towards change and how we deal with forces bigger than ourselves. And when those waves of woe would hit us, it's best to go with the energy of a force that is bigger than ourselves. And when I won the Australian Executive Woman of the Year award, journalists came up and were putting microphones in my face and going, how is it that a Canadian came to win the Australian Executive Woman of the Year? And in a nutshell, I had to be resilient from a time I didn't even know what the word meant, because my birth mother left me in a motel room. I was adopted and I had a great childhood, although we had no money. And I started working at age 13 to save money to go to university because I knew an education was key. A teacher or a nurse were the highest sociological occupations that a girl could strive for in my generation. And I really admired nurses, but I couldn't do bodily fluids, so I became a teacher. And I was riding that reckless wave of youth into my future at university, having worked since I was 13 with part-time job scholarships, student loans, etc. Just riding that reckless wave of youth, even though I'd never seen the ocean, when I got dumped by a tsunami of grief, because the year I graduated, both my parents passed away of cancer. I was an only child. I had no family whatsoever. Even my best friend and her husband were living on the other side of the ocean in Australia. Gotta tell you, I needed a best friend. So I came to Australia with a backpack, $200, and a one-way ticket for a 3-month working holiday. And I've stayed over 30 years. Hey, I never talk on time management. But the biggest problem of my life became the biggest opportunity of my life. And I had the good fortune of boarding with an elderly couple. And Frank Jansen was a great Australian who said, Kath, shift happens. Now, Frank often left out the F when he said shift happens. But when those waves of despair hit us, do we ever ask, why me? This isn't fair. And I did for a while, but we're always faced with the choice of being a victim of change or a victor from change. And I had to shift my attitude, even though I couldn't shift what had happened. And the biggest problem of my life turned into the biggest opportunity. And I'm sure that some of you are listening now that feeling a similar sense of hopelessness. I'm sure that you sometimes feel a similar sense of overwhelming. But I learned a long time ago that we can't take care of others if we don't take care of ourselves. And as caregivers, that's absolutely essential. And for me, we recharge our laptops, we recharge our mobile phones, but what do you do to recharge yourself? For me, it's being out in nature. And research from Stanford University shows that time spent in nature actually helps with mental well-being. So I never celebrated my 21st birthday because that was the year my parents died. So I decided I wanted to celebrate my 40th in a really unique way by climbing Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. And they say that life begins at 40. But as I began training, I thought, yes, life begins at 40, but everything else begins to wear out, spread out, or fall out. But come with me just for a moment, virtual armchair journey to Africa. Picture yourself standing on top of the highest mountain with 360-degree views of Kenya on one side, Tanzania on the other. The most beautiful sight I've ever seen. But imagine it's 30 degrees Celsius. You've got a crashing headache and nausea from altitude sickness. You see crosses where people have died. But no pain, no gain. And they got us up to make the final ascent in the middle of the night. And they said they did that because of avalanche danger when the sun hit the peaks. But I know the real reason they got us up in the middle of the night. If we'd have seen what we had to do in daylight, we wouldn't have done it. Isn't that the same with some of the challenges you take on as caregivers? If you knew how tough it was going to be, maybe you wouldn't have done it. But you're people who care, you're people who want to make a living and make a difference. And shortly after that climb, I had the great honor of having dinner with Sir Edmund Hillary at his home in New Zealand. And for the first man on top of Everest, he was a childhood hero of mine, not just for that first footstep, but what he subsequently did to build 26 schools and hospitals in Nepal. And I remember sitting in his living room, and one of the things he said to me, he said, Catherine, it's not the mountain we conquer, but ourselves. And I thought, that's wise. Because how often do we make mountains out of molehills in our everyday lives and catastrophize about things that we can't change, rather than just focusing on what we can change and taking one step at a time towards that goal, towards that outcome, whether it be a daily, monthly, or an annual outcome. And we all have those personal mountains. And I'm willing to bet that some of you listening to this right now are facing your own metaphorical Everest in your life. And you've just got to take them one step at a time. And I went back for my 60th birthday to Everest Base Camp to deliver some books to the schools that Sir Edmund Hill rebuilt along the way, because he had endorsed one of my books. And I'd like to say that, having been to Everest and doing the things I've done, that I've got the answers, but I don't, because I don't know what the future is going to hold. None of us do. But I do know that when shift happens in either the tectonic plate of the earth with earthquakes or tsunamis, when the shift happens in our personal and professional lives, we have to keep looking towards going forward, because we don't know what changes will happen in Mother Nature or in human nature. And we all remember all of us over 20, that is, remember where we were on 9/11. I was the keynote speaker at the World Airline Conference. The topic: you can't control change, you can only control your attitude towards change. You can imagine the mood in the room. I was at the airport and a friend called to say her mother had passed away of cancer. And to her, that was a bigger tragedy than thousands of strangers on the other side of the world, even though my friend's a very compassionate person. And that made me realize that it's the everyday tragedies in our everyday lives that we have the hardest time dealing with. And I've kept a journal every night since I was 16 of inspirational sayings that got me through tough times. And I started writing a letter to my friend that turned into a book called Hope Happens, which is the opposite of Shift Happens. And it's not a plug for the book, because all the royalties go to the Cancer Council. But whether we've lost a loved one, whether we've lost our health, whether we've lost our wealth, we should never lose hope. Not false hope, but hope combined with action in terms of what we can do in terms of going forward. Because no matter how tough times may seem, it's really important to focus on that, because hope is what happens when you first see a light, just a distant small star in the darkest of night. Hope is what happens when you're poor but not broken. There's a gold mine of dreams, just not yet awoken. Hope is what happens with the smell of fresh rain when your long drought of dreams is renewed yet again. Hope is what happens long after the pain. Hope is what happens again and again. As caregivers, I encourage you to keep hope in your heart. Don't stress about what you can't change. And as you ride those waves of change to the future, you have both my gratitude and my respect.